So I will admit, as overabundant as the trend of reviving and remastering or remaking older game IPs has been as of late, it's also been interesting to see games or franchises that probably would have never seen the light of day ever again actually get a chance to do so. Like, in just the past few years, we've seen the return of games like Klonoa, Streets of Rage, even Bubsy. It often feels like anything has the chance of making a comeback nowadays, and a prime example of that comes from the very recent revival of Kao the Kangaroo. To those unfamiliar with this IP, which I imagine might be a fair few, Kao the Kangaroo was a series of 3D platformers developed in the 2000s by the Polish dev studio Tate Interactive, consisting of 3 games: Kao the Kangaroo, Kao Round 2, and Kao Mystery of the Volcano. The series didn't get much beyond a small cult following though, but it definitely seems like there was a passion behind this series, both with players, especially in Poland, and with Tate themselves. They re-released Kao Round 2, the fan favorite of the trilogy from what I've seen, on Steam a few years back, and for a steal of a price no less. And the full trilogy saw a release on GOG.com last year, also at a steal of a price. But then, this year, they went ahead and released a brand new Kao game, well over a decade and a half after Kao 3. But interestingly, it was a complete reboot of the IP, reimagining the world and characters into something new. Now in my case, I had no idea this series existed during its original run. My first time hearing of it was from NitroRat's videos on it from 2017, which I imagine is how a fair few people first discovered of these games. Granted, I wasn't too eager to try them out at the time, nor were the re-releases out yet, so getting them wasn't super easy to do, but the new game did look interesting to me. I ended up getting it shortly after launch, and now that I've finished it, I felt like sharing my thoughts on it with you all. Now granted, I probably could have, and maybe should have, played through and reviewed the original trilogy before covering this new game, but I felt it could be interesting to talk about this from the perspective of someone who hadn't played the originals. Plus, it is a reboot, so it's not like I have to worry about continuity. That said, I probably will take a look at the original trilogy at some point in the future, but we'll worry about that another time. For now, let's talk about the new Kao game. Oh, also, I will be talking about story spoiler stuff, just a quick heads up. The game begins in this dream sequence, in which our titular hero follows behind his sister Kaya as an ominous voice speaks to her. Before Kao can catch up to his sister though, this time-eater looking creature consumes her. We then get a taste of general movement and combat before Kao wakes up from the dream, thinking it to be a warning. For context, Kao and Kaya's father, Kobe, had mysteriously disappeared some time ago, and Kaya went off to go find him, only to go missing as well as a result. Kao decides he wants to try to find them, and Kao's mother, having accepted the stubborn nature of her family, tells Kao to at least get some training with a local master, a koala named Walt, before going on his adventure. While on his way to Walt's dojo, Kao sees Kaya's spirit, who leads him to a chest containing their father's boxing gloves. Walt reveals that he deliberately locked away the gloves because, as Kao finds out not long after, the gloves are sentient and contain a dark power known as eternal energy. These eternal gloves are essentially like Ara from Dust and Elysian Tale, being a magic weapon that can also talk, though they give advice far less frequently and are largely more cynical and sinister.
Be serious. You only need to look at what is left of the plane.
Oh, you don't know Kaya. She's far too stubborn to give up as easily as that plane did. I'm sure she's still alive and kicking somewhere.
Whatever you say. My dear boy, we can do whatever we want.
Oh? What else you got?
You will see when the time is right, but only when we feel in a sharing mood again.
With these gloves in hand, or I suppose on hands, Kao and Walt set out to find Kaya and Kobe, all the while dealing with situations regarding eternal energy at the areas they go to. In particular, eternal crystals have started showing up and corrupting fighting masters, swaying them from their traditions. For instance, the fighting master of the Hungry Jungle, Jayabaya, has turned his training grounds into an industry for producing a strength-enhancing juice, while the fighting master of the Frozen Mountains, the oldest one, has turned her training grounds into a spa and wellness center. Now, all this may make the game sound like a super narrative-driven game, but the game does keep the story stuff to a minimum, saving a lot of what I explained more so for the start and end of each world, and before and after the boss fights. There are some cutscenes during the levels, and some occasional dialogue during the levels, but the latter is usually just character quips.
Those were the days.
Yeah, those were the days indeed. It's a pity that now there are no days.
With that said, I think the story's alright, being a simple adventure with a light mystery surrounding the person behind the spread of the crystals, a figure simply known as the Eternal Warrior, who turns out to be Minky, a merchant character you meet in the second world who follows along afterwards. He's not the most interesting or entertaining villain admittedly, but I will say, There's something funny about the idea of the merchant character being the main antagonist. It'd be like if Moneybags was the main villain of a Spyro game. Speaking of story stuff, something I think the game probably could have done a bit better is the inclusion of the Eternal Gloves. They're not just infrequent with their advice, they're infrequent with their presence in general. Seriously, for being on Kao's hands the entire game, they remain quiet for a grand majority of it, only getting more talkative once in the final world. And for the semi-arc they're trying to do here, I do wish we had gotten more interaction between them and Kao. While on the topic of the writing, I think the game's comedy is kinda hit and miss. It does have some pretty amusing moments, nothing I burst out laughing at, but I had some chuckles here and there.
But they're the only thing I have left of that. I want to wear them.
Really? You play the sad card?
Yeah.
Little monster.
But on the flip side, this game likes to use pop culture references a fair bit. Some feel more natural than others, like they at least made a decent pun with their YouTube joke.
No one saw? That was lucky. Wouldn't want that on RootTube.
But then there's also stuff like this.
Caves? Hello, darkness, my old friend.
What is cool about the writing, though, is that throughout the game, you collect these scrolls that unlock expanded lore about the game's characters and areas, and a lot of it actually gets quite in depth. Like in-game, Minky reveals that his motive for using eternal power to corrupt the Masters was out of spite for being looked down on as a fighter. But the lore tidbits go a lot deeper into what occurred that led him down that dark path, and the methods he used to keep the different components of his plan under wrap. Stuff like this I find really cool. It allows the cutscene part of the story to remain simple, while having that expanded lore for those who are interested in knowing more. Now as for the gameplay, instead of committing strictly to being either a linear platformer or a collectathon platformer, Kao decides to be both at once. You'll be traversing relatively linear levels with off-beaten paths all throughout, but all the while you'll be collecting these runes to unlock more levels, like stars in Mario 64. Granted, runes in the levels will often just be on the main path, but some runes can also be found in the hub worlds, which I think helps make it work a bit better. It kinda reminds me of New Super Lucky's Tale in that regard, if any of you remember that game, being a linear 3D platformer with collectathon elements. Which, hey, I loved New Super Lucky's Tale, so I'm not complaining. But yeah, Kao works off a similar hub world system, having you go through 4 different hub worlds, each with 2 to 3 levels and a boss fight. Though the hub worlds aren't just for accessing the levels, as they also have collectibles of their own, such as the aforementioned runes and lore scrolls, NPCs to interact with and get some amusing dialogue from, and a shop where you can spend coins to buy health upgrades, extra lives, or costumes for Kao to wear. And in that latter case, there's a lot of good stuff to work with. I found myself largely using this adventurer outfit of his, which looks a lot like his outfit from Kao 3. The hub worlds are definitely fun to explore and be in, to say the least. And on a related note, I do like the general theming of each of the areas. They follow traditional archetypes for platformers. The first world's an island with a volcano, the second world's a jungle, the third world's an icy mountain area, and the fourth world's the spooky world. But there are some unique elements to help make these worlds stand out. Like I noted earlier, the Hungry Jungle is the grounds for a juice-producing industry, so the levels will have you traversing the company's various factories and facilities, platforming above durian juice and turning off machines to halt production. Or the Frozen Mountains, with it being a spa and wellness center. Or the Isle of Eternity being this spooky environment that's also an amusement park. It's good stuff. Now as for Kao himself, he's got a pretty simple moveset. For general movement, he's got a jump and double jump, a roll move for getting through small gaps, he can climb around with his ears, that's gotta hurt, and very amusingly, while climbing, he can do this. Now to clarify, this is a callback to the original games, where his neck would stretch when he's submerged in water, so his head would still be above the water, and he does still do that in this game too. But now he can also stretch his neck while climbing to reach lower down objects, and man, this is both weird and hilarious. And of course, given he's wearing boxing gloves, Kao's got a couple of melee attacks, such as punching and a mid-air tailspin. However, thanks to the power of the Eternal Gloves, Kao's got a few other abilities at his disposal. In particular, he's got an Eternal Energy grappling hook for these hooks, which admittedly can be a bit finicky initially, but also have the potential for nice momentum buildup. And more notably, he can pick up these elemental charges for the gloves. Fire, ice, and wind, to be specific. These enhance Kao's melee attacks, but are also used for a variety of environmental puzzles. Fire can be used to burn away cobwebs or activate heat-based mechanisms, ice can be used to freeze over water, and wind can be used to pull objects towards you. Or pull these platforms from under the feet of enemies. Though another fun usage of these elemental abilities comes into using boomerangs. Every so often in the levels, there'll be a boomerang deposit, and you can use the boomerangs it gives to attack enemies from afar or hit a faraway switch. However, if you've got an elemental charge, it'll apply to the boomerang as well, giving it those elemental properties. The puzzles you get with these elemental powers are relatively simple, but they're a fun addition to the experience. Though because of those boxing gloves, one can imagine that there will be some combat sequences, and sure enough, there are. Now, combat in this game is quite simple. There's no elaborate combo system or anything, so it is kinda button mashy, but honestly, the game does do a good job of making its combat work despite that. Landing punches has good feedback, with KO in particular leaping towards enemies to ensure attacks connect. And as you land attacks, you'll fill up a meter that, when full, lets you use a powerful super punch. The gameplay loop here is simple and satisfying, and the game does a great job of keeping these combat sequences relatively short, so they never feel too repetitive or like they overstay their welcome. It also gives that roll a secondary purpose, allowing you to dodge with it. And you've got that tailspin attack for higher up enemies. Like I said, the combat's simple, but it's effective and pretty satisfying. Heck, simple but effective could be used to describe the game as a whole, to be honest. KO doesn't do anything super innovative, but it does what it knows quite effectively. The same applies to the level design. It's relatively simple platforming challenges, you're not going to get anything nearly as hard as Crash 4, but for what it needs to be, it's done well. Though on that note, the levels get surprisingly long. Like, some individual levels go beyond the half-hour mark in length, but with the unique level settings and the fun usage of its mechanics, it does keep the levels from feeling like they're dragging out too long. Until you're going to the level again to get any collectibles you may have missed. Beyond the runes, each level's got a fair few hidden collectibles that serve different purposes. Each level's got 3 letters that spell out KO, and by getting all the letters in a world, you'll unlock a new costume piece in the shop. There's the previously mentioned lore scrolls, but then there are these gems. There's a ton of them throughout the game, and as far as I'm aware, they don't do anything. Though something else that bugs me about the gems. Upon revisiting a level you've already beaten, when collecting any other collectible you've missed, like a rune, scroll, or KO letter, it'll save that progress, meaning you can just leave the level after you've found it. Not the case with the gems though. If you miss a gem, you'll have to go through to the very end of the level to save any gems you've collected on the revisit. They also reset if you die before you get to your next checkpoint. So all in all, I don't think these gems are worth the hassle. As for the boss fights in each world, these were pretty alright. Nothing super amazing, but none of them were outright bad either. One thing I do like about them all is that they all did a great job of feeling distinct from one another, both in their attacks and in how you fight them. Going in, I thought it was basically just going to be dodge their attacks and then mash the punch button, but nah, all the bosses have more to them than just that, and I think that's pretty neat. Moving on to the technical aspects, here's where some of my biggest positives and negatives of the game come from. Starting with the positives, I do really like the visual style of the game. I know a lot of people joked about the Toys for Bob-like art style, which, yeah, I do get that feel, but it does work to the game's benefit regardless. The environments are vibrant and colorful, the characters have some good expressions, KO especially, it's all good stuff. KO's redesign in general I do quite like, but for those who prefer his classic look, that's actually one of the first costumes you're able to unlock, so you can play through most of the game with that old school look. As for the music, there's some really good stuff in here. The soundtrack's very atmospherically driven, so there's not a ton of super memorable melodies, but there's some really nice atmospheric pieces. Easily my favorite song in the OST is the music that plays for Hopaloo Island, the first hub world in the game. It's just so soothing and feels oddly nostalgic, really fitting for a 3D platformer of this kind. Though all this praise to the music can only really apply when the music's actually playing. Throughout the game, there's this strange glitch where, after warping back from one of the bonus areas into the main level, the level music just doesn't start playing. And that does lead to probably my biggest negative. The game kinda lacks polish in a lot of areas. Never to a point that it's game-breaking or anything, but particularly in the audio design, there's a fair few areas where it noticeably needed more improvement. Same with some of the animations. Nothing that ruins the game, but stuff like pots not visually breaking when attacked, that happened a lot. The only one that I found outright distracting, though, was the animation for the barrels. They're supposed to be bouncing on their way down, but instead they're floating like ghosts. Now granted, this isn't a super high budget game, nor was the dev team super massive, so I don't want to be too harsh in that regard. And I know the process of delaying a game for this kind of stuff isn't as simple as just delaying it, there's a lot more steps to it, and it isn't always cheap to do. But that said, if they were able to, I kinda wish that they gave themselves a bit more time to polish up some of these issues. Because while they were minor to my experience, I imagine they could add up and affect the experience for someone else. But with that said, while it's definitely rough around the edges, I overall enjoyed my time with Kao the Kangaroo. It keeps itself pretty simple, so I don't think it's necessarily gonna blow anyone away, but it does what it does effectively, and I had a pretty fun time with it as a result. It's got some decent length to it as well, with my 100% playthrough taking me about 9 to 10 hours. So if you're wanting another 3D platformer that plays like something from the PS2 and GameCube era, I definitely recommend this. And judging the reactions I've seen so far from already existing fans of the IP, it seems to have satisfied as a KO game as well. With all that said, this has been BenjaMage, thank you all for watching, and until the next video, have a nice day everybody.